Don't show up anymore. That was the cruel message I received. My son believed I had nothing. At dinner, he humiliated me in front of everyone. But when the truth about my bank account came out, his face changed instantly. My name is Margaret. I'm 68 years old, and I'm the mother of David, who's 35. And for you to better understand this story, I'm going to tell you how it all started. You know that moment when you feel the ground disappear beneath your feet? Well, that's exactly what happened to me that Thursday afternoon. I was sitting on the edge of my simple bed, that same bed I'd bought over 20 years ago, when I still dreamed of building a united and happy family. My phone trembled in my hand. It wasn't just any tremor. It was like my whole body already knew that message would change everything. 3 words, just 3 cold words. No period, no explanation. Don't show up anymore. My heart stopped for a few seconds. Breathing? Impossible. That couldn't be coming from who I imagined. But it was. It was from him. It was from my ungrateful son, David. David was 35 years old, and I'd spent every single one of those years dedicating myself to him. Since he was little, I did everything to make sure he never lacked anything. I worked 2 jobs for years, came home late at night with aching legs, but always with a smile on my face because I knew I was building his future. I paid for private school, tutoring sessions, extracurricular courses. When he wanted to go to college, I sold the car I'd just bought. Didn't think twice. After all, what mother wouldn't do that for her son, right? But there, in that moment, holding that old phone with a slightly cracked screen, I asked myself, at what point did all of this stop mattering? The message had arrived precisely that afternoon because I'd asked about dinner. A family dinner that, according to him, would be important. Important to whom, I didn't know. But as a mother, you always want to be present, always want to be part of your children's lives, even when they've grown up and built their own families. I just wanted to know the time, the address, if I needed to bring anything. It was a simple question, even affectionate. And the response? Those 3 words that cut deeper than any knife. Don't show up anymore. As if I were a nuisance. As if my presence were a burden he didn't want to carry anymore. I stood there frozen. Who knows how long? Could have been 5 minutes or a whole hour. The clock on the wall kept making its annoying tick-tock, but I couldn't move. My mind was racing, trying to understand what I'd done wrong. Did I say something that hurt him? Did I meddle too much in his life? Or was it because of her? Sarah, the gold-digger daughter-in-law who entered my son's life 3 years ago. And since then, everything changed. She always looked me up and down, always made a point of showing that I wasn't up to the standard she expected for the family. But I never imagined it would get to this point. I looked at the mirror in my room. An elderly woman of 68 years stared back at me. Gray hair, wrinkles around the eyes that told stories of sleepless nights taking care of a sick child, of financial worries, of joys and sorrows. Was that what they saw? An outdated old woman who no longer fit into their modern life? My hand still held the phone, and for a moment I thought about responding, thought about begging, asking what I'd done, saying I'd change anything to keep being part of his life. But something inside me, a voice I hadn't heard in a long time, whispered, "You deserve more than this." I got up slowly and walked to the closet. There in the back, wrapped in tissue paper that was already yellowed by time, was a dress. Nothing fancy, nothing that would draw attention, just a simple navy blue dress that I'd saved for special occasions. How long had it been since I'd had a special occasion? Years, maybe. But in that moment, as I ran my hand over the fabric, I made a decision. I was going to that dinner, not to beg for crumbs of affection, not to play the victim. I was going because there was something that needed to be said, something that had been stuck in my throat for far too long. I ironed the dress carefully, each movement almost mechanical. My thoughts flew to the past, to all those moments when I swallowed my pride, when I accepted being diminished, when I pretended everything was fine when it wasn't. How many times did I hear Sarah's acidic comments and pretend not to notice? How many times did David stay silent when she mistreated me as if my pain didn't deserve defending? I'd become invisible in my own family, a shadow, a presence tolerated only when convenient. And the worst part, I'd allowed this to happen. I put on the dress slowly, buttoning each button as if I were preparing for battle, because in a way, that's exactly what it was. Not a battle of screams or accusations, but a silent battle for my own dignity. I looked at the worn shoes, the only ones I had to wear for that occasion, and for a moment I felt ashamed. Ashamed of not having anything better, ashamed of not being the rich and glamorous mother they might have expected. But then I took a deep breath. Those shoes had taken me to many important places. They'd taken me to work every day. They'd taken me to the hospital when David was born. They'd taken me here. They had more history than any of Sarah's expensive shoes. Before leaving, I looked at the phone again. The message was still there, blinking like an open wound. Don't show up anymore. Part of me wanted to obey, wanted to simply stay home, accept the rejection, and move on with my life in silence. It would be easier, wouldn't it? Less humiliating, less painful. But then I thought of all the women who came before me, all the mothers who stayed silent, who accepted being erased, who died invisible. I wouldn't be another one. Not this time. If this was going to be my last appearance in their lives, let it be by my choice, not theirs. I grabbed my purse, old, yes, but clean and well-maintained, and put inside only the essentials: wallet, tissue, house keys, nothing more. I wouldn't bring gifts, wouldn't bring expectations. I'd bring only the truth. And the truth, I knew, weighed more than anything material I could carry. I looked out the window and saw it was already getting dark. The streetlights were starting to turn on, one by one, as if they were illuminating the path I was about to take. A path I didn't choose, but that I now needed to follow through to the end. I closed the door and went down the building stairs. Each step was a memory. How many times had I gone up and down here with heavy shopping bags? How many times had I come back exhausted, but happy to have a son to care for? How many times had I run down because David had gotten hurt or was sick? That simple building, in that modest neighborhood, had been my world for so long. And now, I was leaving it to face a world that didn't want me anymore. Or at least, that's what they thought. The taxi I called arrived a few minutes later. The driver was a nice older man who tried to make conversation, but I could barely respond. My head was too full, my heart too tight. I looked out the window as we crossed the city. It was like seeing two different worlds. Mine, simple and forgotten, and theirs, full of lights, fancy restaurants, and imported cars. The distance between these two worlds never seemed so great, but that night, that distance would be crossed. And when I got to the other side, nothing would ever be the same, for them, and especially for me. When the taxi stopped in front of the restaurant, my stomach tied in knots. It wasn't just any restaurant. It was one of those places you see in magazines, with valet parking, huge glass doors, and a doorman in a suit who looks you up and down before you even step out of the car. I paid the fare and thanked the driver, who wished me good luck with a kind smile. Did he sense my tension? Probably. I took another deep breath and walked toward the entrance. The doorman looked at me with that neutral, professional expression, but I could feel the silent judgment. My simple dress and worn shoes didn't match that luxurious setting. As soon as I entered the hall, the air conditioning hit me like a cold blast. But it wasn't the cold air that made me shiver. It was what I saw in front of me. Elegantly decorated tables, crystal chandeliers, people dressed as if they were going to a gala event. And there, at the back of the hall, was my son. David was in a suit, hair perfectly combed, laughing at something someone had said. Next to him, Sarah. The gold digger daughter-in-law looked stunning, of course. Party dress, jewels that sparkled even from a distance, that perfect smile she used as a mask. They were surrounded by other people, friends or colleagues, I wasn't sure. I took the first step toward the table, and it was like time had slowed down. The noise of conversations continued, but I started noticing something changing in the atmosphere. Heads turning discreetly in my direction. Quick glances, almost furtive, scanning me from head to toe. A woman in a red dress nudged her friend beside her and whispered something, covering her mouth with her hand. Another person frowned, as if trying to understand what a woman like me was doing there. I wasn't welcome. That became clear before I even reached the table. Sarah saw me first. I saw when her eyes landed on me, when her smile froze for a split second before transforming into something between surprise and displeasure. She immediately leaned toward David's ear, her lips moving fast while keeping her eyes fixed on me. I didn't need to hear to know what she was saying. Probably something like, "What's she doing here?" or, "Didn't you say you'd handled this?" David turned his head in my direction, and our eyes met. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something on his face. Discomfort? Guilt? But he quickly looked away, as if I were an unwanted stranger who'd crashed his party. I kept walking. Each step felt like it weighed a ton, and I could feel everyone's stares in the hall glued to me. The disguised giggles started. They weren't loud, weren't direct, but they were there. That kind of muffled laughter, made by people who think they're being discreet, but aren't. A real story like this, you never forget. It's the kind of humiliation that marks you, that burns from the inside. I got closer, and could see Sarah's expression better. She evaluated me as if I were an old piece of clothing someone insisted on wearing to an important occasion. Her eyes went over my simple dress, my worn shoes, my hair that I'd arranged so carefully at home. David still wouldn't look directly at me. He messed with his phone, pretended to be busy, anything to avoid acknowledging my presence. My own son, the boy I carried in my arms, whom I rocked to sleep when he had nightmares, whom I taught to tie his shoes and ride a bike, now pretended I didn't exist. Sarah said something to him again, this time a bit louder, and some people at the table turned to see what was happening. The ungrateful son I raised was right there, in front of me, choosing to ignore me, choosing her, choosing appearance, status, comfort, and discarding his own mother. I approached the table and stopped a few steps away. Nobody got up to greet me. Nobody pulled out a chair. Nobody smiled. The silence that formed around me was deafening. Sarah crossed her arms, tilted her head slightly, and gave me that fake smile I already knew so well. It was the kind of smile that says, "You shouldn't be here." David finally looked at me, but his face was tense, almost irritated. There was no warmth there. There was no love. There was only impatience and embarrassment, as if my simple presence were a problem he didn't know how to solve. "Hi," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My voice came out lower than I expected, almost choked by the emotion I was trying to control. Sarah didn't respond, just kept staring at me with that icy look. David mumbled something that sounded like "hi" back, but without looking me in the eyes. Some people at the table exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable. Others simply returned to their conversations, as if I were transparent. One of them, a middle-aged man with a glass of wine in his hand, made a low comment to the woman beside him, and they both laughed. I don't know if it was about me, but it felt like it. A waiter passed by, and I tried to get his attention to ask where I could sit. He looked at me for a second, then looked at David, as if waiting for confirmation. David said nothing, simply shrugged and went back to talking with the person beside him, leaving me there, standing, like an idiot. Sarah, on the other hand, was loving every second of it. I could see it in the gleam in her eyes, in the way she adjusted herself in her chair, confident and superior. She'd gotten what she wanted. She'd turned my son against me, and now she was there, savoring my humiliation like it was expensive champagne. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, someone indicated a chair. It wasn't near David. It wasn't near anyone, actually. It was almost at the end of the table, isolated, as if I were a last-minute guest nobody really wanted there. I walked to the chair and sat down slowly, trying to maintain my composure. My purse stayed on my lap because I didn't know where else to put it. My hands trembled slightly, so I clasped them tightly to disguise it. Around me, the conversations continued animatedly. Laughter, toasts, stories being told. But I was there, sitting in the middle of that party, completely alone. Sarah went back to whispering with David, this time discreetly pointing to the menu. They talked among themselves, planning what to order, laughing at inside jokes I wasn't part of. I was an elderly mother being treated like a burden, like something that should have stayed hidden at home, away from everyone's eyes. And the worst part? I'd come all the way there, even after that cruel message, even knowing I wasn't welcome. But I needed to. I needed to look them in the eyes and decide once and for all what to do with all of this. While I waited for some kind of interaction, any crumb of attention, I looked around the hall. Other families were dining together, laughing together, hugging each other. Proud parents with their children, grandparents being fawned over, kids running between tables. It was an emotional story for each of those people. Stories of love, of unity, of belonging. And there I was, in the middle of all that, invisible. The difference between what I saw and what I was living was brutal. But something inside me, in that moment, started to change. It wasn't just pain anymore. It was something different. It was anger. It was determination. And it was the certainty that this couldn't continue like this. The waiter started circulating around the table, serving the guests with an almost choreographed elegance. Red wine for some, sparkling water for others, colorful drinks that looked like works of art. He went from person to person, always with a polite smile, always attentive. I watched when he got close to David and Sarah. They ordered appetizers, main course, and dessert, all from the most expensive menu, of course. Sarah even made a point of asking about the wine's origin, whether it was French or Italian, as if that really mattered. The waiter responded patiently, wrote everything down, and moved to the next person. And the next, and the next. Everyone was served. Everyone, except me. I sat there waiting for my turn. I thought maybe he'd just forgotten, that he'd come back in a few minutes. But the minutes passed, and nothing. I saw when they brought the appetizers for the others. Beautiful plates, well presented, that gave off that smell of expensive food you can sense from afar. People started eating, commenting on the flavors, making those approving sounds. My stomach growled quietly. But it wasn't just from hunger. It was from humiliation. I was sitting at that table, surrounded by people, and it was as if I didn't exist, as if I were a ghost nobody could see. I tried to get the waiter's attention discreetly, raising my hand just a little bit. He passed by me without even looking. I tried again. Nothing. I felt my face heating up, that horrible feeling of embarrassment that rises from your chest to your cheeks. Wasn't anyone seeing this? Wasn't anyone going to say anything? I looked at David, hoping he'd notice, that he'd do something, but he was too entertained with his food, laughing at something the friend beside him had said. Sarah shot me a sidelong glance, noticed perfectly what was happening, and simply smiled to herself before taking another sip of wine. Finally, after what felt like centuries, the waiter came back. He had a plate in his hand, a plate visibly different from the others. While everyone had received generous, well-decorated portions, mine was simple, basic, almost sad. He placed the plate in front of me without ceremony, without that polite smile he gave the others. It was mechanical, cold. "Here you go," he said, and was already turning before I could even thank him. I looked at the plate. It wasn't bad, don't get me wrong, but it was obvious it was different. It was the type of meal you give to someone you want to feel exactly how I was feeling, inferior. I picked up the fork and knife, but before I started eating, I looked around. Everyone had their glasses full, except me. My glass was empty. They hadn't even offered me water. That's when I noticed where I was sitting. It wasn't just at the corner of the table. It was literally on the margin. My chair was a few inches farther away than the others, as if someone had deliberately positioned me to be on the outside. I was there, but I wasn't part of it. I was present, but isolated. It was a silent, calculated humiliation. It wasn't an open attack, which somehow made everything even worse. It was subtle. It was cowardly. I started eating slowly, trying not to make noise, trying not to draw attention. But each forkful was hard to swallow. Not because of the food, but because of the lump in my throat that wouldn't go away. I heard when Sarah commented to the woman sitting beside her in a tone that wasn't exactly low. "You know how it is, right? Elderly people sometimes don't understand boundaries, don't know when it's time to give their children space to live their own lives." The woman gave an understanding little laugh and nodded. They weren't looking directly at me, but it was clear, crystal clear. That comment was about me. I felt my hands grip the fork tighter. This gold-digger daughter-in-law had nerve. She had the audacity to talk about me as if I were a burden, as if my presence were an unbearable inconvenience. And the worst part is that she did it knowing I could hear. She wanted me to hear. She wanted me to feel small, unnecessary, unwanted. And David, my ungrateful son, was sitting right next to her, hearing everything, and said absolutely nothing. Didn't defend me, didn't ask her to stop, simply kept eating, as if those words had no weight at all. The conversation around the table continued animatedly. Someone told a joke and everyone laughed loudly. Someone toasted to new achievements, and glasses clinked in the air. I was there, in the middle of all that, but completely invisible. Nobody asked me how I was. Nobody struck up a conversation with me. Nobody even offered me a drink. It was as if I'd been invited just to serve as contrast, so everyone could feel better about themselves next to me. Look how well we're doing. Look how badly she's doing. That's what that scene silently screamed. I tried to stay strong, tried not to let them see how much this was affecting me. I kept my back straight, my head high, even though inside I was shattered. This was an emotional story of the kind nobody wants to live through, the kind that makes you question everything you did, all the choices you made. Had I gone so wrong as a mother? Did I deserve this treatment? Was all the love, all the sacrifice, all the effort I gave over decades worth so little? More plates were served, more drinks, more laughter. I stayed there, in my isolated chair, pushing the food around without much appetite. At one point, a couple at the table started talking about their parents, about how grateful they were for everything they'd done. They spoke with affection, with admiration. I listened and felt each word like a stab, because that's exactly how I expected my son to talk about me. That's how I deserved to be treated. But no, to him, I was just a problem, a burden, something he needed to get rid of. Sarah ordered dessert with that air of someone who's used to having everything they want. She chose something expensive, of course, and even commented that she was celebrating new times. What new times were those? Times without me? Times when she'd finally managed to completely drive my son away from me? She shot me another look, this time more direct. It wasn't a look of anger or contempt. It was worse. It was a look of victory, as if she were saying, I won, he's mine now, and you're nothing. But while she savored that moment of supposed victory, while everyone around continued oblivious to my pain, something inside me started to solidify. It wasn't just anger or sadness, it was clarity, a cold and absolute clarity. I'd allowed this. I'd allowed them to treat me this way. I'd stayed silent for so long that they believed I had no voice. They believed I was weak. They believed they could discard me without consequences. But they didn't know anything. They didn't know the woman I really was. They didn't know what I was capable of. And above all, they didn't know what I was about to reveal. While everyone continued talking and laughing, my mind started to travel. I went back in time to all those years when I built an image. The image of the simple mother, of the woman who could barely pay her bills, of the elderly woman who depended on others' goodwill. This image wasn't created overnight. It was carefully constructed, brick by brick, over decades. And why? Because I learned early on that showing what you really have is inviting problems into your home. It's attracting gold diggers, people who only care about you when they need something. So I hid it. I hid it so well that even my own son believed the lie. David grew up seeing sacrifices. He saw when I sold the car, when I worked 2 jobs, when I economized on everything so he could have the best. What he didn't see were the decisions I made behind the scenes. He didn't see when I invested in stocks that multiplied. He didn't see when I bought that small property downtown that appreciated beyond any expectation. He didn't see when I opened that savings account that grew, month after month, year after year, until it became something substantial. I did all of this in silence because I wanted him to value the effort, not the money. I wanted him to understand the value of work, of dedication. But it seems he learned another lesson. He learned to look down on me. I remember when he entered college. It was a moment of immense pride for me. My son, studying at one of the best universities in the region. He never imagined how much that cost, not just in money, but in planning. I'd saved for years for that moment. I'd anticipated every cent, every tuition payment, every book he'd need. When the time came to pay, I simply paid. He thought I'd taken out a loan, that I was drowning in debt because of him. I let him think that, because I wanted him to value the education he was receiving. I wanted him to feel the weight of that opportunity. Then came his first financial crisis. David had just graduated and wanted to open his own business. It was his dream, and I wasn't going to be the person to destroy that dream. But businesses need startup capital, and he didn't have any. He came to me, half embarrassed, half desperate, and asked for help. I borrowed from a friend, that's what I said. Actually, I withdrew from my investment fund. It was $30,000 that he promised to return as soon as the business started making profit. The business did well, but the money never came back, and I never asked for it. Because for me, helping my son was never about expecting financial return. It was about love. A few years later, when he met Sarah, everything started to change. In the beginning, she was sweet, polite, always with that perfect smile. But I saw beyond the facade. I saw how she looked at my simple house with poorly disguised contempt. I saw how she made subtle comments about improving in life and not settling for mediocrity. She wanted David to be ambitious, to seek more, to leave behind everything that held him back, including me. And it worked. Slowly, my son started to distance himself. Visits became rarer, calls shorter, and when he looked at me, he no longer saw the mother who raised him. He saw what Sarah taught him to see, an old woman, poor, outdated. When they got married, there was another crisis. The gold digger daughter-in-law wanted a big party, one of those that appears in magazines. David didn't have enough money. She went hysterical, threatened to cancel everything, made a scene as if the world were ending. And he came to me again, this time, more embarrassed. "Mom, I know I have no right to ask, but could you help?" Of course I could. "I got a loan," I lied again. I transferred $15,000 to his account. The party was dazzling. Sarah was radiant. And me? I stayed in a corner of the hall, wearing a borrowed dress because I didn't want to stand out. Nobody thanked me properly. Nobody acknowledged what that meant. But the biggest help came 2 years ago. David's business was sinking. A bad investment decision, a dishonest partner, accounts that didn't add up. He was on the verge of bankruptcy. Sarah panicked because the lifestyle she loved so much was threatened. They could lose the house, the car, everything. And guess who showed up to save the day? Me. This time, it was $50,000. I sold some old jewelry from my mother, I made up. The truth? I withdrew from an investment that was yielding well. But they couldn't know that. They couldn't know that the broke, elderly mother actually had solid financial security. David was grateful, of course. For a few weeks, he went back to being attentive, went back to calling frequently, went back to visiting me. But Sarah, Sarah never liked the fact that he'd needed his poor mother to save himself. That hurt her ego. So she started a silent campaign to distance me. She started planting seeds of doubt in his head. "Your mother's getting old, David. You need to live your life. You can't keep worrying about her all the time." And he, my ungrateful son, started to agree. He started to see my presence as a burden. He started to see me as Sarah saw me. Sitting at that table, remembering all of this, I felt a mixture of emotions. Anger, yes. Sadness, for sure. But also something like relief. Because I'd kept that secret for so long that it was starting to suffocate me. Every time they treated me as if I were worthless, I wanted to scream, "You don't know anything. You don't know what I did. You don't know what I have." But I held back. Because I was afraid. Afraid that if they knew the truth, things would get worse. Afraid that greed would speak louder than love. And looking at them now, I realized my fear was right. The dinner continued, and I continued invisible. But my mind was boiling. I thought about each check I signed, each transfer I made, each lie I told to protect them from greed. Because deep down, I always knew. I always knew that if they discovered I had money, everything would change. Not for the better. They wouldn't love me more. They'd only see me as a source of resources. And I preferred to be seen as poor and useless than as rich and exploitable. At least that way, I could still believe that whatever affection remained was real. Sarah ordered more wine and made a toast. "To new beginnings," she said, with that venomous smile. David raised his glass and toasted with her, completely oblivious to what those words meant. New beginnings, without me. That's what she was celebrating. Her victory. My defeat. But while she savored that moment, while everyone around continued indifferent to my presence, a decision crystallized inside me. No more silence. No more pretending. No more protecting people who didn't deserve protection. Because the silence I'd maintained for all these years wasn't protecting me. It was destroying me. It was authorizing them to treat me like trash. It was allowing them to believe I had no value, that I had no voice, that I had no power. But they were wrong. So wrong. And that night, in that elegant restaurant where I was publicly humiliated, where I was treated like an intruder in my own son's life, I decided it was time for them to discover who I really was. It was time for the mask to fall. And when that happened, nothing would ever be the same again. I took a deep breath and placed my fork on the plate. My hands stopped trembling. Something inside me had changed. It was like a key had turned, unlocking a door I'd kept closed for too long. I looked around the table, at all those people chatting animatedly, oblivious to my suffering. I looked at David, my son, who avoided my gaze as if I were an embarrassment. I looked at Sarah, the gold digger daughter-in-law, who smiled with that poisonous satisfaction of someone who believes they've won. And then, with a calm I didn't even know I possessed, I lightly tapped the side of my water glass with my knife. The sound rang through the hall. The conversation started to diminish, first slowly, then faster. Heads turned in my direction, some with curiosity, others with poorly disguised irritation. Sarah frowned, clearly bothered by the fact that I was drawing attention. David looked at me with an expression that mixed surprise and concern, probably thinking I was going to make a scene, that I was going to beg for acceptance, that I was going to humiliate myself even more. But I wasn't there to beg. I was there to end this. "May I speak for a moment?" I asked, my voice coming out firmer than I imagined would be possible. There was an uncomfortable silence. Some people exchanged glances, not knowing how to react. Sarah discreetly rolled her eyes and whispered something to David, probably something like, "I can't believe she's going to make a scene." But I'd already started. I wasn't going to stop anymore. "I know I'm not welcome here," I began, looking directly at my son. "I received a very clear message earlier today. Don't show up anymore." 3 words that made it pretty obvious how inconvenient I've become in your life. But even so, I came, and you must be wondering why. David opened his mouth as if he was going to interrupt me, but I raised my hand. "Let me finish, just this once." My voice didn't waver, not once. "I came because I realized you're living in an illusion that I myself created, I must admit. During all these years, you believed I was just an elderly mother, poor, dependent, someone who could barely pay her own bills, someone who was a weight, a burden you had to carry." I paused, letting the words echo. Some people leaned forward, clearly interested now. This was a real story they didn't expect to witness. "But the truth is quite different," I continued, feeling a strange sense of freedom as I spoke. "Remember when you entered college, David? That expensive university you wanted so badly? I paid for it. Every tuition payment, every book, every fee. It was 4 years of punctual payments. You thought I'd taken out loans, that I was drowning in debt. But I didn't take out any loans. I had the money. I always had it." I saw when David's face started to pale. He was starting to understand where I was going with this. Sarah, on the other hand, was tense, her fingers gripping the napkin tightly. "And your first business? Remember that?" I asked, keeping my tone calm, almost casual. $30,000 you urgently needed. You came to me, embarrassed, asking for help. I said I'd borrowed it from a friend. Lie. I took it from my investment fund, money I'd saved and multiplied over the years. You promised to return it as soon as the business took off. It took off, but the money never came back, and I never asked for it because you're my son." My voice carried a bit of emotion in that last part, but I composed myself quickly. It wasn't time for weakness. The people at the table were completely silent now, all eyes fixed on me. Sarah had completely lost that superior smile. Her eyes jumped from me to David, trying to process what she was hearing. "And your wedding?" I continued, looking directly at her now. "That dazzling party you wanted so badly? $15,000 also came from my account. There was no loan, Sarah. It was my money. Money I had, but chose to hide because I didn't want you to see me as a bank. I wanted you to see me as a mother. And 2 years ago," my voice got a bit harder now, "when the business was sinking, when you were about to lose everything, the house, the cars, the lifestyle, who showed up? Me. $50,000. No, I didn't sell old jewelry. I had that money invested. Investments I made intelligently over decades. Investments that multiplied. And I used that money to save you from bankruptcy." I paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. "In total, over these years, it was more than $150,000 that I invested in you, David. In your education, in your dreams, in your family." David was pale, completely pale. His mouth was half open, but no sound came out. He stared at me as if he were seeing a complete stranger. The mother he thought he knew, the simple woman without resources that he could ignore and discard, was revealing herself to be someone completely different. Sarah had dropped the napkin and was now gripping David's arm under the table, her fingers digging into his suit sleeve. She wasn't worried. She was calculating. I could see it in her eyes, that greedy gleam waking up. This wasn't an emotional story of regret. It was a revelation that completely changed the game. "You treated me as if I were worthless," I said, my voice lower now, but still firm. "As if my presence were a nuisance. As if I were a weight you had to carry. But the irony is that each achievement of yours, each step you took, each success you celebrate today, has my fingerprints all over it. I was the foundation, I was the base, and you treated me like rubble. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't let the tears fall. Not there, not in front of them. The silence that followed was absolute. Some people at the table seemed embarrassed, not knowing where to look. Others were clearly shocked. A man at the end of the table murmured something quietly to his wife beside him. David finally tried to speak, his voice coming out hoarse and hesitant. "Mom, I didn't know. Why didn't you ever say anything?" I looked at him, really looked, and saw not a regretful man, but a man processing information, calculating, recalculating, just like Sarah beside him. "Because I didn't want it to be about the money," I replied simply. "I wanted it to be about love, about family, about genuine gratitude, not because of what I had, but because of who I was. But it seems I was wrong. It seems you only see value in what has a price." I got up slowly from the chair, taking my purse. "Now you know the truth. Now you know that the elderly mother you despise so much is actually someone who never needed you. But you always needed me." And with that, I turned my back and started walking toward the exit, leaving an entire hall in absolute silence behind me. I didn't look back as I walked toward the exit. Each step was firm, decided, completely different from the hesitant walk I had when I entered. I felt everyone's stares pinned to my back, the heavy silence I left behind. But before I reached the door, I heard David's voice. "Mom, wait!" He'd gotten up so fast that the chair almost toppled. I stopped, but didn't turn immediately. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for what would come next, because I knew exactly what was happening in their heads at that moment. It wasn't regret, it wasn't love, it was panic. I turned slowly and saw David standing in the middle of the hall, with Sarah right behind him. His face was red, a mixture of shock, confusion, and something else, fear. It was fear in his eyes. He opened his mouth a few times before managing to form words. You really have all that? Invested money? Everything you said is true?" His question wasn't, "Why didn't you tell me?" Or, "Why did you feel obligated to hide?" It was about the money. The first thing that came out of my ungrateful son's mouth was to confirm how much I had. Not if I was okay, not if I was hurt, but how much I was worth. "Yes, David, it's true," I replied calmly. "Every word, every number. I have bank statements, transfer receipts, investment documents, everything recorded, everything legal, everything mine." I saw when Sarah took a step forward, her eyes shining with that calculating intensity I already knew so well. The gold-digger daughter-in-law was processing everything at record speed. I could almost see the gears turning in her head. But you always lived so modestly," she said, trying to sound confused, but her voice betrayed the greed that was starting to awaken. "Why would you do that?" "Because I wanted peace," I replied, looking directly at her. "I wanted to live my life without being seen as a source of money, without having people around me only out of interest. I thought, if I pretended to be simple, poor even, the people who stayed by my side would be the ones who really cared about me." I paused, letting a bitter smile escape. "But it seems I made a mistake, because even pretending to be poor, you still discarded me, still treated me like trash. So imagine if you'd known the truth from the beginning. It probably would have been worse." David ran his hand through his hair, that nervous gesture he'd done since childhood. "Mom, this is crazy. Why are you telling us this now? Here? In front of everyone?" I looked around. The people at the table were all still silent, watching the drama unfold like it was a movie. "Because here, in front of everyone, you humiliated me," I replied simply. "I thought it was fair that the truth also be revealed in front of everyone. You made me feel small, insignificant, invisible. Now everyone here knows who the truly insignificant person in this story really was." Sarah moved closer, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw something different on her face. It wasn't contempt or arrogance anymore. It was interest, pure interest. "Look, Margaret," she said my name for the first time that night. "I think there was a huge misunderstanding. We never wanted to make you feel this way. It's just, well, you always seem so reserved, so distant. We thought you preferred it that way." Her voice was soft now, almost sweet. completely different from the tone she used minutes ago when she said that elderly people should know when not to bother. The transformation was so quick, so obvious, that it was even embarrassing. Misunderstanding? I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Sarah, you literally said less than an hour ago that elderly people don't know when it's time to give space. You said that while I was sitting at the same table as you. And David, I turned to my son, you sent me a message telling me not to show up anymore. There was no misunderstanding. There was contempt, there was rejection, and there was total, calculated, and intentional humiliation. I saw when his shoulders dropped slightly. He knew there was no way to deny it. The message was there, on my phone, forever recorded. But now things can be different, Sarah insisted, and there was urgency in her voice now. Now that we know, that we better understand the situation, we can start over. We can be a real family. We can take better care of you. Take care of me? What a joke. Take care of me how? I asked, crossing my arms. Or do you mean take care of my money? Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but I continued. Because it's funny how your care only appeared after you discovered I have a healthy bank account. Where was that care when I walked in here today? Where was it when I was served last? Where was it when they put me isolated in the corner of the table? David took a step forward, trying to take control of the situation. Mom, I know we messed up. I know we treated you badly, but we're family. We can fix this. We can get closer again. I can start visiting you more. We can have dinner together every week. We can what? I interrupted. Pretend everything's fine? Pretend I didn't spend the last few years being gradually erased from your life? Pretend you didn't choose her over me, repeatedly? I pointed discreetly at Sarah. David, you became an ungrateful son. And the worst part is, you don't even realize it. The environment around us was electrically tense. Some people from the table had gotten up, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Others remained seated, but with that rigid posture of someone who doesn't know whether to intervene or not. Sarah whispered something urgent in David's ear, her nails still dug into his arm. She was desperate now. I could feel control of the situation slipping from her hands. Because the elderly mother she despised so much, that she worked so hard to drive away from her son, had just revealed herself to be an independent woman, financially stable, and much smarter than she ever imagined. How much do you have? Sarah suddenly asked, subtlety completely abandoned now. David looked at her with an expression of shock, as if he couldn't believe she'd actually asked that question. But I wasn't surprised. In fact, I was expecting it. That's none of your business, Sarah, I replied calmly. But it's enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. It's enough not to need to depend on anyone. And it's definitely enough for me to choose who I want to share my life with, or not share it. The implication hung clear in the air. I had resources, I had power, and they had just realized they'd lost any access to it. I saw when reality fell on them like a bucket of cold water. David wasn't just worried about having hurt me anymore. He was worried about what he'd lost. Sarah was already clearly calculating, trying to figure out a way to reverse the situation, to bring me back under her control. But it was too late. This emotional story was reaching a turning point, and they were on the wrong side of it. I'm leaving now, I said, gripping my purse more firmly. And this time, when I walk out that door, it'll be by my choice, not because you sent me away, because I decided I deserve more than this. And with those words, I turned again and walked toward the exit, leaving behind a son in shock and a daughter-in-law in panic. The days that followed that dinner were strange, very strange. I came home that night feeling lighter than I'd felt in years, despite everything. I'd told the truth, I'd defended myself, I'd recovered a piece of my dignity. But I also knew that wouldn't simply end there. I knew my son, and I knew Sarah, especially Sarah. She wasn't the type who gives up easily, especially when there's money involved, so I wasn't surprised when, 2 days later, my phone rang. It was David, the first call from him in months that wasn't out of obligation or necessity. I answered, curious to see what strategy they'd come up with. Hi, Mom. His voice was soft, almost childlike. It was the tone he used when he was a kid and wanted something. I wanted to apologize to you. For real. For the dinner. For the message. For everything. I was horrible to you, and I have no excuse. I stayed silent, waiting, because I knew there was more. There was always more. Sarah and I talked a lot these past few days. About you, about us, about how things got bad. And we want to fix this, Mom. We want you to be part of our lives again. For real this time. Part of me. That part that was still a mother, that still loved that boy, wanted to believe. But the other part, the part that had been hurt too much, remained cautious. I'm glad you're reflecting, David, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. But these things take time. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight. He agreed quickly, maybe too quickly. I know. But we can start, can't we? How about dinner at our house next week? Just the three of us, no pressure, no other people. Just an honest conversation. I accepted, but with reservations. Part of me wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, the shock of the revelation had actually opened his eyes, that he'd finally realized how much he'd hurt me. But another part, the wiser part, whispered that I should be careful. The following days were marked by a radical change in behavior. Suddenly, David was calling every day. Just to see how you are, he'd say. Sarah sent affectionate messages, something she'd never done before. Thinking of you, dear mother-in-law. Dear mother-in-law. She'd never called me that. It was always Margaret, said with that cold tone. Or she simply didn't call me anything at all. Now it was, dear mother-in-law, dear Margaret, even mommy in some particularly sugary messages. The transformation was so obvious, so fake, that it was almost comical. The gold digger daughter-in-law was in full manipulation mode. When the day of the dinner arrived, I went to their house. It was a nice house, spacious, in an elegant neighborhood. A house that my money had helped save from foreclosure, but they'd probably forgotten that convenient detail. Sarah opened the door with a huge smile, almost opening her arms to hug me. Margaret, so glad you came. Come in, come in. The house was impeccable. The table set carefully, candles lit. They'd really made an effort, or at least wanted me to think they had. David appeared from the kitchen, also smiling, also excessively kind. It was like being in a poorly rehearsed theater play. The dinner started with light conversation. They asked about my health, about my house, about how I was spending my days. Genuine interest? Unlikely. But I answered politely, observing, waiting to see where this was going to lead. It didn't take long. Between the appetizer and the main course, Sarah cast the first bait. You know, Margaret, David and I were talking. You're getting older and, well, managing finances can be complicated, especially with investments and all these things. Have you thought about getting help with that? There it came. The first move. So predictable, I almost sighed. What kind of help? I asked, feigning innocence. David quickly interjected, as if he'd rehearsed. Nothing major, Mom. Just, we could help organize your accounts, make sure everything's being well managed. We can even talk to your bank manager, better understand your investments, just to make sure you're not being, well, exploited. Exploited. What irony. The woman who'd built her wealth through intelligent decisions over decades was being treated as if she were incapable of taking care of her own money. I appreciate the concern, I replied calmly, but I have an excellent financial advisor. Everything's under control. The disappointment was visible on their faces, but they tried to disguise it. Sarah changed tactics. Of course. It's just, well, you live alone, Margaret. And at your age, sometimes memory can play tricks, Not that you have problems, she rushed to add when she saw me frown. But it's natural. It happens to everyone. Maybe it would be good to have someone as a kind of backup? Someone who could help in case of emergency? Backup. She wanted access to my accounts as backup. This woman's audacity knew no limits. My ungrateful son remained silent, allowing her to lead the conversation, as always. What exactly are you suggesting, Sarah? I asked, deciding to be direct. She exchanged a quick look with David before continuing. Well, we could be added as co-owners, or at least have power of attorney, just for emergencies, you understand. God forbid something happens to you, but if it does, it would be easier if we could help immediately. Ah, so that was it. They wanted direct access. They wanted their names on my accounts. They wanted control. The elderly mother who finally revealed she had money was now being targeted in a shameless attempt to take that money. This emotional story was taking an even darker turn. No, I replied simply. One word, clear and definitive. Sarah blinked as if she hadn't heard correctly. No. I'm not adding anyone to my accounts. I'm not giving power of attorney. My finances are my responsibility, and I'm going to keep them that way. The silence that followed was heavy. David finally spoke, and there was a hint of irritation in his voice now. Mom, we're just trying to help. Why are you being so difficult? Difficult. I was being difficult for wanting to maintain control over my own money. I'm not being difficult, David. I'm being sensible. The atmosphere in the room changed completely. The forced kindness started to crack at the edges. Sarah got up to get more wine, but when she came back, her smile was more tense. You know, Margaret, it's funny how you hid that money from everyone. Almost seems dishonest, don't you think? Making your own son believe you were in need when actually you were sitting on top of a fortune. It was a veiled accusation. She was trying to make me feel guilty, trying to turn the tables. Interesting you say that, I replied calmly, considering you're trying to manipulate me into giving you access to the money you criticize me for having hidden. The rest of the dinner was tense. The masks had completely fallen now. They kept trying, in increasingly less subtle ways, to convince me to give them some kind of control over my finances. They used fake concern, guilt trips about family, even insinuations that I was getting forgetful and confused. But I held firm. When I left that house, I knew two things with absolute certainty. First, that they had no genuine regret. They just wanted my money. And second, that this was far from over. They weren't going to give up, and I needed to be prepared for what would come next. Because knowing Sarah, knowing how she operated, I knew things were about to get much worse. 2 weeks after that disastrous dinner, I received a call that chilled me to the bone. It was from a lawyer, not just any lawyer. It was someone David and Sarah had hired. Mrs. Margaret, my name is Thomas Brennan, and I'm calling on behalf of your son, David Mitchell. He's concerned about your mental health and capacity to manage your own finances. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss the possibility of establishing legal guardianship. Legal guardianship. They wanted to declare me incapable. They wanted to take away my right to manage my own life, my own money. My heart beat fast, but my voice came out calm when I replied, Mr. Brennan, I don't have any mental health problems, and I don't need guardianship. He continued with that professional and distant tone. I understand your position, ma'am, but your son alleges that you've demonstrated erratic behavior. He mentions that you hid significant financial information from the family for years, which may indicate paranoia or mental confusion. There are also reports that you've become increasingly socially isolated. Each word was a stab. They were building a case against me. They were using the fact that I'd maintained my financial privacy as evidence of mental instability. The strategy was cruel, but smart. If they could get me declared incapable, they'd have total access to everything I had. My ungrateful son was literally trying to steal my autonomy. I hung up the phone and sat on the edge of the bed, needing a moment to process what was happening. They'd gone too far, much too far. But then, a strange sense of calm invaded me. Because the truth is, I was already prepared for this. Not exactly for this, but for something bad. In recent years, as I watched my relationship with David deteriorate, as I watched Sarah's poisonous influence grow, I'd started to protect myself. I'd started documenting everything. Regular medical appointments, annual cognitive assessments, all my financial records meticulously organized. I'd prepared myself for war, even without knowing exactly when it would start. The next day, I called my own lawyer. Patricia Chen was a brilliant woman I'd hired years ago to take care of estate planning matters. I explained the situation, and she listened in silence, taking notes. When I finished, she sighed. Margaret, this is serious. But the good news is, you have an impeccable medical history. I'm going to need copies of all your exams, psychological reports, medical reports from the last few years. Everything that proves your lucidity. I have everything, I replied. I keep everything organized in digital and physical files. I heard the relief in her voice. You're a wise woman, Margaret. That's going to make all the difference. In the following days, I gathered all the documentation. Reports from appointments with my trusted doctor, Dr. Harrison, who'd been following me for 15 years. Cognitive assessments done annually since I turned 65, all showing perfect mental function, excellent memory, intact reasoning capacity. Records of my financial transactions, all carefully planned and executed, showing a pattern of intelligent and consistent decisions over decades. Reference letters from my financial advisor attesting to my competence. Each document was a weapon against the lies they were trying to build about me. The meeting was scheduled for a week later. Patricia guided me on what to expect. They're going to try to make you seem confused, forgetful, paranoid. They'll use isolated examples and distort them. You need to stay calm, objective, and clear in all your answers. I practiced mentally. I reviewed each document. But above all, I kept my head high. Because this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a battle for my dignity, for my autonomy, for the right to live my life on my own terms. And I wasn't going to lose to an ungrateful son and a gold-digger daughter-in-law who only saw dollar signs when they looked at me. The day of the meeting arrived. It was in an elegant office downtown. David and Sarah were there, of course, sitting next to their lawyer, Thomas Brennan. They avoided my gaze when I entered, which told me everything I needed to know about how comfortable they were with what they were doing. Patricia was by my side, a huge folder full of documents in hand. Dr. Harrison was also present as a medical witness. His expression was one of poorly disguised disapproval when looking at David. He'd known my son since childhood and clearly didn't approve of what was happening. Thomas Brennan began presenting their case. My client is genuinely concerned about his mother's capacity to make sound financial decisions. There's evidence of secretive behavior, social isolation, and questionable decisions. He started listing the fact that I'd hidden my real financial situation, the fact that I lived alone and rarely received visits, the fact that I'd created elaborate stories about where the money came from that I gave David. Each point was presented as if it were a symptom of dementia or paranoia. It was a masterful distortion of the truth. Sarah had that expression of fake concern on her face, as if she really cared. Nauseating. Patricia then opened the folder. I'd like to present contrary evidence. And she began. Report after medical report. All recent, all showing I was in perfect mental health. Cognitive assessments that scored my memory, my logical reasoning capacity, my temporal and spatial orientation, all above average for my age group. Dr. Harrison testified personally. Margaret Mitchell is one of the most lucid and mentally sharp patients I have. There's absolutely no sign of cognitive decline or mental instability. I saw when David's face started to turn red, when Sarah's expression changed from fake concern to something closer to panic. But Patricia didn't stop there. She presented my complete financial history, each investment, each transaction, each decision over 30 years. As you can see, she explained, there's a consistent pattern of intelligent and successful financial decisions. This is not the behavior of someone mentally incapable. This is the behavior of someone extremely competent. She even brought my financial advisor, Mr. Kowalski, who testified about my shrewdness with investments. Mrs. Mitchell is one of the most impressive clients I've ever had. She understands the stock market better than many people half her age. Her decisions are always well thought out and strategic. Thomas Brennan tried to argue that secretive behavior was still concerning, but Patricia was prepared. Secretive or just private? Mrs. Mitchell has every right to keep her financial situation private. This isn't a symptom of mental illness. It's a constitutional right. And as for the social isolation you mention, she pulled out photos of me at a book club I attended weekly, at yoga classes, at lunches with friends, at volunteer work I did at a local shelter. As you can see, Mrs. Mitchell has an active and healthy social life. The fact that she doesn't spend time with people who treat her badly, she looked directly at David and Sarah, isn't isolation. It's common sense. Their case started to crumble right there. Thomas Brennan tried to save the situation, asking me direct questions, trying to make me seem confused, but I answered each one with clarity, with details, with precision. I cited dates, amounts, names. I explained each financial decision I made. I even laughed at one point when he asked if I remembered a specific investment I made in 2015. I remember perfectly. I bought shares of the tech company when they were down after a scandal. Sold 3 years later with 340% profit. One of my best decisions. The total humiliation was now theirs. David couldn't even look me in the eyes. Sarah was pale, realizing their gambit had failed miserably. And Thomas Brennan? He was visibly uncomfortable, probably realizing he'd been used in a despicable attempt to rob a perfectly capable elderly woman. This real story was taking a turn they definitely didn't expect. When the meeting ended, the silence was absolute. Thomas Brennan gathered his papers with quick, nervous movements, avoiding any eye contact. Patricia gave me a discreet smile of victory while organizing our documents. Dr. Harrison squeezed my hand with genuine affection before leaving, but not without first casting a look of disappointment at David. And then it was just the four of us. Me, Patricia, David, and Sarah. The tension in the air was so thick it could be cut with a knife. My son finally raised his eyes, and what I saw there wasn't regret. It was embarrassment. Embarrassment at being caught, not at having tried to destroy me. "Mom, David began, but I raised my hand. "No, now you're going to listen to me." My voice came out firmer than I expected, reverberating through the empty office. "You just tried to declare me mentally incapable. You tried to take away my right to live my own life, to control my own money. You attacked me in the cruelest way possible, trying to destroy my credibility, my autonomy, my dignity." I saw when Sarah tried to interrupt, but Patricia cut her off with a sharp look. "Mrs. Mitchell is speaking," my lawyer said with authority. Sarah backed down, but her eyes shone with barely contained anger. "For years, I stayed silent," I continued, feeling each word burn in my throat. "I stayed silent when you started to distance yourself, David. I stayed silent when she entered your life and started to push me away even more. I stayed silent when you treated me as if I were a burden, as if my presence were a nuisance. I accepted crumbs of attention and pretended everything was fine. Why? Because I love you. Because you're my son, and I wanted to believe that, deep down, you still cared." My voice failed a little, but I composed myself quickly. It wasn't time to show weakness, not in front of them. David ran his hand over his face, a gesture of frustration. "Mom, it was Sarah who—" "No!" My voice came out louder than I intended. "Don't put the blame on her. You're a grown man, David. You made your choices. You sent that message. You ignored me at dinner. You hired a lawyer to take away my legal capacity. These were your decisions. You can't hide behind her forever." I saw when something changed on his face. Shame, maybe. Or just more embarrassment at being called to take responsibility for his own actions. My ungrateful son was finally being forced to look at what he'd become. Sarah, unable to stay quiet any longer, stood up. "Look, Margaret, okay, we understand you're upset, but all this drama is unnecessary. We just wanted to make sure you were being well taken care of. That's what families do." The audacity, the pure audacity of this woman. "Families?" I repeated, my voice icy. "Sarah, you never treated me like family. From the first day you entered my son's life, you looked at me with contempt. You judged me for my simple house, my modest clothes, my lifestyle. You systematically worked to drive me away from him because I didn't fit the image you wanted for your perfect family. And when you discovered I had money," I continued, also standing now, facing her directly, "suddenly I became interesting, didn't I? Suddenly I was family again. Suddenly you wanted to include me, wanted to help, wanted access to my accounts." I took a step toward her. "You're a gold-digger daughter-in-law, Sarah. You always were. And the saddest part is that my son was so blind to whatever it is he feels for you, that he allowed you to transform him into someone I don't recognize anymore, into someone capable of betraying his own mother for money." Sarah turned red. "How dare you? How dare I what?" I interrupted. "Tell the truth? You gave me a message today, even without meaning to. You showed me how far you're willing to go. You have no limits, no scruples, and you definitely have no love or respect for me." I turned to David, who was sitting with his head down, hands clasped. "Look at me, David." He hesitated, but finally raised his eyes. "Tell me something. At any point, at any moment in this whole process of hiring a lawyer and trying to declare me incapable, did you stop to think about me? About the woman who raised you? About the mother who gave up everything for you?" He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out, because there was no answer that could justify what he'd done. "Do you know how long I worked to build what I have?" I asked, my voice softer now, but no less intense. "How many nights I stayed awake, planning, saving, investing. All of this while raising you alone, while making sure you had everything you needed. I built my wealth with intelligence and hard work. And you tried to take everything from me with lies and manipulation." This emotional story of family betrayal was reaching its climax, and there was no going back. "We didn't want to take anything from you," David finally managed to say, his voice weak. "We just wanted We wanted to make sure you were okay. Lie, my voice echoed through the office. You wanted control. You wanted access. You wanted to guarantee that when I die, because that's what you're thinking about, isn't it? There would be no obstacle between you and my money. I saw when he flinched at my words, because they were true and he knew it. But here's the thing, David. That money? It's mine, every cent of it. And I'm going to decide what to do with it. Not you, not her, me. Patricia approached, gently placing a hand on my shoulder. It was a gesture of support, but also a reminder for me to keep control. I took a deep breath before continuing. I want you both to understand something very clearly. What happened today, this attempt to destroy me, changed everything. There's no going back. There's no starting over. There's no pretending we can be a happy family again, because you proved, beyond any doubt, that you're not trustworthy, that you don't care about me, that you only care about what you can gain from me. Sarah tried to protest again, but one look from me silenced her immediately. I'm going to redo my will, I announced. I saw when both their eyes widened. I'm going to make sure my estate goes to places and people that really matter, charitable institutions, causes that touch my heart, maybe some friends who were there for me when you weren't. But you two? I paused, letting the weight of the words hang in the air. You won't see a cent. The shock on their faces would have been comical if it weren't so tragic. You can't do that, Sarah whispered. I can and I will, I replied simply. It's my money, and this is my choice. David got up abruptly, knocking the chair behind him over. Mom, please, don't do this. We made a mistake, okay? A terrible mistake. But we're family. You can't just discard us like that. The irony of his words didn't go unnoticed. I can't discard you? I repeated slowly. David, you sent me a message saying don't show up anymore. You literally discarded me. And now when you realize you're going to lose financially, suddenly family matters? I shook my head, feeling a mixture of sadness and liberation. It doesn't work like that. Motherhood isn't an eternal debt I owe you. It's not an obligation to accept any treatment. And it's definitely not a contract that guarantees your inheritance regardless of how you treat me. I turned to leave, Patricia by my side, but I stopped at the door and looked back one last time. David was standing, paralyzed, with an expression of growing desperation on his face. Sarah was visibly trembling, her face oscillating between anger and panic. You had a mother who loved you unconditionally, I said, my voice now calm, almost sad. You had someone who sacrificed, who gave everything, who would be there whenever you needed. But you chose to throw that away. You chose greed instead of gratitude, interest instead of love. And now, I paused, now you're going to have to live with the consequences of those choices. Because I'm not going to accept being diminished, used, or erased anymore. Never again. And with those final words, I left that office, leaving behind not just my son and his wife, but an entire lifetime of unrecognized sacrifices and unrequited love. The months that followed that final confrontation were the most transformative of my life. In the first few days, I admit, there was pain. There were nights when I woke up thinking about David as a child, about the sweet boy who'd run to hug me when I came home from work. There were moments when I picked up the phone, almost calling him, almost giving in. But then I'd remember. I'd remember the cold message. I'd remember the humiliation at the restaurant. I'd remember the attempt to declare me incapable, and the pain would transform into something different, into determination. Determination to live my life on my own terms, without allowing anyone else to make me feel small. The first thing I did was, in fact, redo my will. Patricia helped me structure everything carefully. My estate would be divided among charitable institutions that had always touched my heart: shelters for vulnerable women, education programs for low-income youth, a fund for elderly people abandoned by their families. Part was designated for the few true friends who remained by my side. And yes, I left something for David, a symbolic amount of $1,000, along with a letter explaining why. Not out of cruelty, but so it would be clear that this was a conscious choice, not an oversight. I wanted him to know he'd had the chance to have everything, but chose to lose everything. David tried to contact me a few times in the first weeks. Calls I didn't answer. Messages I read but didn't respond to. There was even an attempt to show up at my door, but I simply didn't open it. Patricia advised me to document all contact attempts in case there was a legal need in the future. Sarah, I noticed, stopped trying after a few weeks. She'd lost interest as soon as she realized there was nothing more to gain. The gold digger daughter-in-law had moved on, probably already looking for another source of resources. Part of me felt sorry for my son, still trapped with that woman. But he'd made his choice, repeatedly. With my life finally free from that weight, I started doing things I'd postponed for years. I'd always wanted to travel, but never allowed myself to. It's too expensive, I used to think. I need to save for emergencies. But for what? For whom? Now I had clarity. That money was mine to enjoy while I still had health and energy. My first trip was to Italy. I'd always dreamed of seeing Rome, Florence, Venice, and it was magical. Walking through ancient streets, tasting authentic food, meeting people from all over the world. For the first time in decades, I felt alive, really alive. I met incredible people on these trips. Other women my age, also traveling alone, also rediscovering life after years dedicated to other people. We shared stories, laughter, even some tears. One of them, Helen, became a dear friend. She also had a difficult story with her children. Different details, but the same essence of ingratitude and financial interest. We both understood each other in a way few people could. It wasn't about becoming bitter or hating our children. It was about refusing to continue living as victims of their choices. I went back to more regularly attending the book club, yoga classes, volunteer work at the shelter, but now with a different energy. I wasn't doing it anymore to fill a void or to prove my mental sanity. I was doing it because I genuinely enjoyed it, because it made me feel good, because those people saw me, heard me, valued me for who I was, not for what I had or could offer. At the shelter, especially, I found purpose. Helping other women, many of them elderly and abandoned by their own families, became something deeply meaningful. I understood their pain, and I could offer not just resources, but genuine empathy. I also changed some things in my daily life. I renovated my house, not because I needed to impress anyone, but because I deserved a beautiful and comfortable space. I painted the walls with colors I liked. I bought new furniture. I installed that garden I'd always wanted on the balcony. Each change was a declaration. This is my house, my life, my space. And I don't need to pretend to be less than I am anymore. I don't need to live anymore as if I were apologizing for existing. I bought new clothes, not necessarily expensive, but clothes that made me feel good, that reflected who I really was. There was a specific moment, about 6 months after the confrontation, when I realized how much I'd changed. I was sitting in a cafe, drinking a cappuccino and reading a book. The sun came through the window, warming my face, and suddenly I realized I was happy, genuinely happy. There wasn't that constant weight on my chest, that anxiety about when David was going to call, that worry about how he and Sarah were seeing me. For the first time in years, I was simply being Margaret, not the rejected mother, not the humiliated woman, just Margaret, a 68-year-old woman who'd lived, learned, suffered, and was now choosing peace. I'm not going to lie and say I never think about David. I do. Sometimes I look at old photos, at that smiling little boy, and I feel a tightness in my heart. I miss what could have been, the relationship we never had, the family I always wanted. But I've also learned that love doesn't mean accepting any treatment, that motherhood isn't martyrdom, that I can love my son from a distance without allowing him to continue hurting me. It's a different form of love, a love with boundaries, with self-protection, with dignity, and that's okay. I made new emotional wills too, not just the legal one. I wrote letters to people who'd impacted my life positively. To Dr. Chen, my pediatrician when David was little, who always encouraged me. To Mrs. Rodriguez, my neighbor who helped me in difficult times. To Helen and my other new friends, expressing gratitude, sharing memories. I realized I'd spent so much time focused on the broken relationship with my son that I'd neglected all the other relationships that were healthy and nurturing. I was correcting that now. I was emotionally investing in people who invested in me. An interesting thing happened. Some extended family members, distant cousins, aunts, started reaching out to me. At first, I was suspicious. Did they also know about the money and want something? But most seemed genuinely interested in reconnecting. Some had even heard versions of the story through family gossip and wanted my side. I didn't share all the details, but I made it clear I was fine, that I was moving forward. Some of these reconnections became valuable friendships. I realized I had more family than I thought, just not in the place where I expected to find it. I also started writing. Nothing professional, just a journal, documenting my journey, my thoughts, my feelings. Writing became therapeutic. It helped me process decades of repressed emotions. It helped me understand my own patterns, how I'd gradually become invisible, how I'd allowed them to treat me badly in the name of family peace. Reading those pages gave me clarity. It reminded me why I'd made the decisions I made. And on harder days, when doubt tried to creep in, those words anchored me. They reminded me I was on the right path. Today, when I look in the mirror, I see someone different from the woman who walked into that restaurant months ago. I see someone stronger, more confident, more whole. The wrinkles are still there, the white hair too, but there's something different in the eyes, a sparkle that had disappeared and now has returned. I'm no longer bent under the weight of unmet expectations. I'm no longer trying to make myself smaller to fit into spaces that weren't made for me. I'm free, free from the approval of people who never valued me, free from the need to prove my worth, free to simply live the way I choose for the reasons that matter to me. And that freedom is priceless. It's what no amount of money can buy, but what courageous choices can conquer. And that's how I reclaimed my life, not through revenge, not through anger, but through the choice to put myself first for the first time in decades. I learned that true love doesn't accept humiliation, that being a mother doesn't mean being a doormat, that dignity isn't negotiable, not even in the name of family. Today, I live in peace, a peace I built with my own hands, with my own choices. And if I could go back in time, I'd do everything differently from the beginning. I wouldn't hide who I am. I wouldn't pretend to be less. I wouldn't accept crumbs of affection. Because nobody, absolutely nobody, deserves to be treated the way I was. And nobody should accept being erased from their own life. And have you been through something similar? Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever had to choose between your dignity and the love of someone who should love you unconditionally? What would you do if you were in my place? Tell me here in the comments. I want to know your story, your thoughts, your experiences. If this story touched your heart, if you felt every word as if you were living it with me, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss other emotional stories that bring life lessons and make us reflect on our own choices and relationships. Because we all deserve to be seen, valued, and loved for who we really are, not for what we have or can offer. See you in the next story.